Every Saturday morning, the scene outside Juilliard Pre-College in Manhattan looked like something out of a movie. Sleek black Escalades, polished BMWs, and the occasional Tesla lined up in front of the building like they were waiting for a red carpet event. Chauffeurs opened doors, designer shoes clicked against pavement, and teenage prodigies emerged, some carrying violin cases, others with custom-made flutes or portfolios of sheet music. Inside the glass-paneled building, ambition filled the air like static electricity. But at the end of one long corridor, lit by soft golden overhead lights and lined with portraits of famous alumni, there was a figure who didn't sparkle, didn't glide, didn't call attention to herself. Grace Miller, 65, moved slowly, steadily, pushing a gray janitorial cart with one hand while the other clutched a mop. Her uniform was plain and utilitarian. Her sneakers had soles worn thin by decades of walking. She didn't wear a watch. She didn't need one. Her life was a routine written in quiet rituals. She was invisible to most. To students, Grace was part of the building's background, like the polished floors or the soft hum of the central heating. Nobody knew that those hands, now chapped, knotted with age, gripping a mop, had once danced across the keys of a grand Steinway, performing Debussy's Clair de Lune in a symphony hall larger than any classroom here. Saturday mornings were particularly lonely for Grace, not because she disliked solitude, far from it, but because on Saturdays, the contrast between her world and theirs became impossible to ignore. She would watch them from a distance. Emma Walker, tall and blonde, daughter of a venture capitalist who had donated $500,000 for the new auditorium. Jackson Lee, a cello prodigy who'd already been on NPR. Maya Reynolds, jazz pianist, homeschooled, and already a sensation online. These kids lived in a universe of expectation and applause. Grace's universe was quieter, more grounded, and painfully unrecognized. This Saturday was no different. The sky outside was gray, heavy with snow that had not yet fallen. The air inside the building was warm but dry, like the backstage of a theater. Students rushed in with their Starbucks cups and buttery croissants wrapped in crisp white paper. One young man dropped his coffee, dark liquid spreading like a shadow across the gleaming marble tiles. He looked down, met Grace's eyes for a moment, and walked away. No apology, not even a nod. Grace set down her mop, squatted slowly, and began to clean. As she did, her lips moved softly. She was humming a melody, one that only she could hear. Her mind didn't register the cold of the floor or the sting in her knees. It was Debussy, of course. Always Debussy. His notes still lived inside her bones. She finished mopping, wrung out the mop head, and stood with some difficulty. Her knees weren't what they used to be. Nothing was. But as she moved to the next hallway, her fingers tapped quietly against her thigh, echoing a rhythm she had memorized long before these students had ever touched an instrument. In the music wing, a new grand piano had arrived just days ago. A Steinway, gleaming, smooth, black as a raven's wing. Grace had seen it being delivered, wrapped in protective cloth, wheeled in with the reverence of royalty. It had taken 3 men to move it. She had watched from a corner, her breath shallow. Today, as she passed the practice room, the door stood ajar. Nobody was inside. The piano sat there, still pristine, like it had never been touched. Grace stopped pushing her cart. Her eyes narrowed. Her heart thudded. She stepped in, almost against her own will. The room was silent. The kind of silence that asked to be filled. She approached slowly like someone approaching a grave or an altar. Her right hand rose, hesitated, then gently touched the lid of the piano. The wood was cool. Her fingers traced the edge, then slid across the top like one might stroke the back of a sleeping animal. She didn't open the lid, not yet. Footsteps echoed behind her, sharp, confident. Playing house Auntie Grace, it was Emma. Leaning against the doorframe, latte in hand, blue eyes glittering with sarcasm. Grace stepped back, hand dropping to her side. Emma chuckled. "You gonna play that thing or polish it with Windex?" She took a long sip and walked away. Grace stood still for a long time. That night after her shift, Grace walked 3 blocks to a small brick church nestled between apartment buildings. She entered quietly, nodded at the old custodian, and moved toward the organ. No one else was there yet. Sunday services wouldn't begin until morning. She sat down, exhaled, and began to play. Softly at first, then with more confidence. The sound filled the empty church, rich, layered, full of a lifetime's worth of emotion. No audience, no applause, just her. The music was a kind of prayer. Back at Juilliard, the practice room was dark again. The Steinway stood untouched, but in the janitor's closet, tucked behind rolls of paper towels and a bag of old mops, was a plastic sleeve. Inside it, one sheet of music, yellowed and fragile. Claire de Lune, Boston Symphony Audition, 1981. She had never played it again, but maybe, just maybe, she would. Fame has a way of dressing up pride in silk and lighting even the darkest motives with a warm glow. On the Juilliard pre-college campus, where talent and privilege walked hand in hand, no student understood that better than Emma Walker. She was brilliance wrapped in satin, top of her class, daughter of a billionaire, admired for her poise, her beauty, and her haunting renditions of Chopin. Teachers loved her, students followed her. She was the very definition of the American elite, polished, ambitious, and untouchable. But Grace Miller remembered the way Emma had looked at her that Saturday morning by the Steinway. That smirk, that disdain. Emma had no idea she had knocked on the door of a memory buried so deep it hadn't seen light in over 40 years. It was a regular weekday at Juilliard, lunchtime. The halls buzzed with energy, students hurrying between rooms, instruments in tow, the air filled with fragments of piano melodies and cello drones. Glass walls vibrated gently from overlapping harmonies, and from each classroom burst a symphony of effort, pride, and expectation. Grace pushed her cart through the quieter corridors. These were the less glamorous parts of the building, hallways leading to storage rooms, backstage areas, and restrooms. She moved like a shadow between spotlights, each step echoing a rhythm of a life, long-lived and often overlooked. In the cafeteria, sleek white counters offered organic options from local farms. Menus rotated on mounted iPads, and students tapped screens to select gourmet salads, truffle fries, and kombucha blends. Grace sat in the janitor's closet. Her lunch was a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper. She sipped warm water from a reused bottle. Across campus, Emma laughed as she customized her avocado toast. That afternoon, in classroom 204, Mr. James Carter lectured on musical authenticity. "Emotion is not technique," he proclaimed, pacing in front of a Steinway upright. "It's what bleeds through technique." Emma raised her hand, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "But what if someone who mops the floors thinks she can play piano? Would that count as real emotion too?" The class erupted in laughter. Carter chuckled. "Well, perhaps she can clean up after a performance, but I wouldn't count on her leading one." Outside the glass door, Grace wiped the windows in silence. She heard every word. Later, as she passed the foyer, Emma sauntered by with her friends. A bottle of beet juice slipped from her hand and burst across the floor in a red puddle. Emma paused, locked eyes with Grace, then turned and walked away. Grace kneeled. The sting in her knees was sharp today. But sharper still was the silent message behind those cold, dismissive eyes. She mopped. That evening in the cafeteria, Emma sat with a group of friends. They giggled over espresso mousse and compared rehearsal notes. "Impromptu performance day is next Friday," said one girl. Emma smirked. "Maybe we should ask Ms. Mop to give us a show. Let's see if she can play anything other than a mop." Laughter. Shrill. Entitled. Only one face didn't laugh. Tyler, 17, black, gifted at composing, and perpetually on the outside. He looked down at his tray, said nothing. He didn't laugh. He also didn't speak. Grace walked behind them later, emptying the trash. She heard the remnants of their joke, watched Emma saunter out with her chin lifted like royalty. That night, Grace went home to her small apartment in Harlem. She opened a worn drawer and pulled out a yellowed sheet of music. Claire de Lune, the same one. She sat in her creaky wooden chair, the air around her still. From a nearby shelf, a photo stared back at her. Her younger self, eyes filled with light, hands mid-performance. Grace whispered, "Maybe. Just one more time." At Juilliard, Mr. Carter finished reviewing the solo selections for the winter recital. Predictably, Emma had been chosen for the centerpiece piece, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor. She smiled, radiant. She didn't know the storm she'd sparked. After hours, Grace quietly entered classroom 204 to clean. As she swept behind a row of desks, she noticed a folded paper slip out of a backpack, Tyler's. She picked it up, a handwritten composition, a beautiful melody. She recognized raw talent in the notes. She placed it gently back and smiled. Dreams, she thought, weren't only for the chosen. Sometimes they just waited for the right moment to rise, and Grace could feel it now. That moment was coming. Sometimes what stuns an audience isn't a perfect performance. It's when someone you always look down on steps into the spotlight and makes the whole world go silent. Grace Miller had played the piano behind the pulpit of a quiet Harlem church for years, always behind the scenes, always anonymous. But today, there would be no curtains to hide behind, no pews to separate her from the crowd, no quiet, no cover. It was Friday afternoon, the final class of the week, and Juilliard's largest rehearsal room was alive with tension and expectation. It was Impromptu Performance Day, a tradition where students could volunteer or be chosen to perform unrehearsed on the spot. The grand piano sat at the center of the stage like a polished monument to talent. The walls, glass and white brick, carried sound so crisply that even a breath could be heard in the far corner. The students filled the room, buzzing with gossip and anticipation. Emma Walker sat near the front with her friends, perfectly poised, sipping from a glass water bottle etched with her initials. Mr. James Carter stood near the piano, clipboard in hand, reviewing notes with the casual authority of someone used to being listened to. Grace was mopping the floor just outside the room. She hadn't planned on staying long, just finish the job and move on. But then it began. Emma raised her hand, her voice light and sugary. "Mr. Carter, why not invite Ms. Miller to play a piece? Let's give her the stage she deserves." A ripple of laughter broke out across the room. Carter raised an eyebrow, caught off guard, then smiled. "Ms. Miller, would you join us? Just one piece. Humor us." Grace froze. Her hands clutched the mop. Her breath caught in her throat. She stepped into the room slowly, every eye turning to her like stage lights. Some students laughed openly, others whispered. A few looked at her with something resembling pity. Emma leaned toward her friend and whispered, "This is going to be hilarious." Mr. Carter gestured to the bench. "We don't expect much, just a little fun." Grace looked at the piano. Her feet moved forward against her will. She sat. The bench creaked beneath her. Her fingers trembled slightly. She nearly stood up to leave. But then she remembered the words from church, the first time she'd played again after decades of silence. Let the music speak. She placed her fingers on the keys. One note. A simple E-flat rang out, soft and solitary. Someone in the back giggled. Grace closed her eyes, took a deep breath, then she played. Clair de Lune. The room changed. The notes floated like candlelight, drifting through the air with aching clarity. She didn't perform. She remembered. She relived. She breathed life into every phrase. The students stopped whispering. The giggles died. Emma's smirk faded. Mr. Carter's hand, still holding his clipboard, dropped to his side. The music spoke. And it spoke of loss, of dignity, of longing, of beauty, of a woman who had once had the world at her fingertips and was now reclaiming it. Grace forgot the room, forgot the stairs, the laughter, the decades. Her fingers danced, her soul poured out. When the final note rang out, it lingered. And then, silence. Not a breath, not a whisper, just stunned, reverent quiet. Emma's mouth was slightly open. She looked around, unsure. Her cheeks flushed red. For once, she had nothing to say. Mr. Carter's lips parted, but no words came. Tyler, in the corner, wiped a tear from his cheek. He didn't understand why he was crying. Only that, for the first time, someone who looked like him had filled that room with something undeniable. Pride. Grace stood slowly. She didn't bow. She didn't smile. She simply walked out. The door clicked softly shut behind her. The mop leaned quietly against the wall where she had left it. And in the silence that followed, everyone knew. The woman they thought they knew was someone they had never really seen. No one clapped. No one spoke. But in the silence, everyone in that room knew. Something profound had just happened. And nothing, not the class, not the teacher, not even Emma Walker, could return to the way it was. The final note of Clair de Lune hadn't just ended a song. It had ended an era, an age where Grace Miller was just a shadow in the corner of their eyes. The light outside had grown golden now. It streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the rehearsal hall, reflecting off the polished grand piano, bathing the room in a soft, glowing hush. The soundboard still hummed faintly, as if reluctant to let go of the music. Grace sat motionless, eyes closed, like she had just emerged from a decades-long dream, and no one dared move. Emma sat with both hands gripping the edge of her chair, her knuckles pale. Her jaw locked, her mind raced, searching for a joke, a deflection, anything to break the spell. But there was none. Mr. Carter, who had once conducted entire orchestras with effortless precision, now stood like a statue, clipboard limp at his side. His eyes were locked on Grace, or rather, on the space she now occupied in his mind. A space she had just redrawn. Grace finally opened her eyes. She looked ahead, not at them, but through them. She didn't ask for applause. She didn't need it. She stood slowly, bowed her head slightly, then turned and walked toward the exit. Not a single voice called after her. Not a single chair creaked. Only Emma's whisper, barely audible. "Who is she?" In the quiet, a voice rose, not loud, not sure, but steady. "Tyler." "She played what I've always wanted to say," he said, voice trembling. "And none of us ever asked what she had to say." The words hung in the air, heavier than silence. Students looked around, unsure how to respond. For once, in a room full of voices trained to project, It was silence that carried the greatest weight. Emma attempted a laugh, weak and awkward. "Well, it's not like she wrote that piece, right?" But the words fell flat. Her friends didn't join in. One girl beside her glanced over with something close to disappointment, then looked away. Emma felt it, her grip slipping. Later, in the hallway, Mr. Carter stepped outside. He saw Grace at the far end, neatly placing a bin bag into her cart. For a moment, he couldn't move. Then, almost mechanically, he walked toward her. "Ms. Miller," he called. She turned, calm, composed. I had no idea," he said. His voice was raw. Grace looked at him, not unkindly. "That's the thing about blindness, Mr. Carter," she said. "You rarely know it's there until something opens your eyes." She turned back to her cart. He stood for a moment, speechless. Then he noticed the envelope she had left on the edge of the cart, carefully placed. Inside, an old manuscript. Claire de Lune, with a note scrawled in faded pen. Grace Miller, Boston Symphony Audition, 1981. He flipped through the pages. It wasn't just a score. It was annotated in detail, markings of breath and phrasing, whispers of feeling she had carried all these years. "How did we never see this?" he murmured. Back in the room, the piano sat untouched. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the city skyline, a young journalist named Carla Nguyen arrived at Juilliard to interview Mr. Carter for a series called Music in Education. But before she found him, she heard whispers from a student. "Did you hear what happened today?" That night, Carla wrote an article from her tiny apartment, the keys of her laptop tapping like raindrops. The janitor who silenced Juilliard and played the truth. It went viral. Within days, the story spread across faculty, alumni, musicians' forums, even morning shows. Emails flooded the school, some in praise, some in protest, but none in ignorance. And in Harlem, Grace Miller walked to the same church, sat at the same organ bench, played the same music. But this time she felt something different. She wasn't invisible anymore. Not all spotlights fall where we expect them to. Sometimes the light finds its rightful subject after decades spent in darkness. The article, "The Janitor Who Silenced Juilliard," hit like a drum roll across campus. Overnight, Grace Miller became a name whispered in the cafeteria lines, in practice rooms, and in the faculty lounge. Reddit threads blew up. A segment aired on morning television. And suddenly, a question buzzed louder than any violin scale. Who is Grace Miller, and why was she cleaning floors instead of commanding concertos? Mr. Carter hadn't slept. The old sheet music Grace left behind had haunted him, its notations more moving than anything he had seen in years. By morning, he knew the truth. Silence was no longer an option. He walked through the school as if wearing new eyes. What he once passed without notice now carried weight. The custodian's closet, the mop left leaning by the rehearsal door, the way some students still avoided looking Grace in the eye. The school changed almost imperceptibly at first. Students who had once ignored Grace now watched her with wary curiosity. A few offered shy greetings. A couple of teachers nodded, as if acknowledging something they should have seen long ago. Conversations bloomed around practice rooms and dining tables. Debates sparked in faculty meetings. Some argued the moment was being blown out of proportion. Others said it hadn't gone far enough. But Grace, she remained quiet. She didn't read the headlines. She didn't watch the broadcasts. When asked for comment, she declined. All she wanted was to return to music on her terms. Meanwhile, Emma Walker's name had been conspicuously absent from conversation. Her friends drifted. The awe she once commanded had vanished. Her solo for the Juilliard Winter Gala, reassigned. To Grace Miller. In the staff lounge, Mr. Carter extended the invitation face to face. "I want you to play at the Juilliard Winter Gala," he said, "as our featured performer." Grace stared at him for a long moment. Her hands were folded, her brow unreadable. "You sure this isn't just damage control?" He paused, then nodded. Maybe it started that way, but now it's just the right thing. Grace said nothing, but she accepted. Not out of pride, but because she understood something the rest of them were just beginning to learn. The stage wasn't about who you were. It was about what you carried with you when you stepped into the light. Emma learned about the change from the list posted on the green room wall. She scanned it once, twice. Her name was gone. In its place, Grace Miller. She walked to Mr. Carter's office, fists clenched. But when she arrived, she stopped short. Through the glass, she saw him at the piano, Grace beside him, not cleaning it, but playing. Their heads were close, sharing a phrase. Carter was smiling, not out of pity, but reverence. Emma didn't go in. She turned. And for the first time in this story, her eyes didn't burn with anger or pride, but something quieter, something close to regret. A few days before the gala, Grace returned to her apartment and found a letter waiting at her door. No return address. She opened it cautiously. Inside was a typed message. "Dear Ms. Miller, I saw you perform once, in Boston, 1981. You played Claire de Lune in a room full of men who were too proud to hear you. But I heard you. I left that day and never forgot your music. I failed to speak up then. I was young, scared, and stupid. But I'm watching now, and I'm proud of you. A former judge, now a lifelong admirer." Grace folded the letter slowly. A single tear slid down her cheek. She hadn't been forgotten after all. On the day of the final rehearsal, the auditorium shimmered with preparation. Technicians adjusted lights. Programs were being printed. And on stage, the Steinway Grand waited. Grace walked in, not in her janitor uniform, but in a black velvet gown. Her silver hair was pinned back with elegant simplicity. Every head turned. A silence passed through the room like a bow across strings. A freshman whispered, "Is that her? The janitor?" A classmate replied, reverently, "No, that's the artist." Grace sat down, centered herself. Her hands hovered over the keys. In the back of the hall, Carla Nguyen opened her notebook, writing a new headline, "The Return of Grace." And just before the first note fell, the spotlight flicked on, not to elevate, not to embellish, but to reveal what had always been true. This was Grace's stage now. And no one, not the judges from 1981, not the students who laughed, not the silence that haunted her, could take it away again. Not every melody needs an audience to shine. Some are simply waiting for the right moment to speak on behalf of a life long overlooked. Grace once said, "I don't need a stage, I just need someone to listen." Tonight, the entire concert hall stood in reverent silence, and every gaze belonged to her. It was the night of the Juilliard Winter Gala, the most anticipated event of the year. The grand hall shimmered under golden lights. Every seat was filled, alumni, donors, press, even a few big names in the music world seated quietly in the front row. But no one, not even they, were the center tonight. Grace Miller's name was printed on the official program, front and center. Backstage, Mr. Carter stood behind the curtain, no longer the conductor, just a witness. Tyler, in his first suit, fidgeted nervously in the student section, eyes wide with wonder. And 3 rows from the front, Emma Walker sat alone, hands folded tightly in her lap, no longer the center of attention, but for the first time, willing to listen. The MC stepped onto the stage, his voice warm and simple. "Tonight, we welcome someone who's been part of this building longer than most of us. But tonight, she's not a worker. She's an artist. Please welcome Grace Miller." Applause followed, not thunderous but full of respect, deep, honest, and sincere. Grace emerged slowly, dressed in a flowing black gown. She didn't bow. She walked to the Steinway, sat gracefully, and paused. Her fingers hovered above the keys. Then, without a word, she began. She didn't play Debussy. She played something older, something hers. A piece she had written in 1981, never performed, never published. The music filled the room, raw, aching, and beautiful. There was youth in it. There was loss. There were the echoes of empty church pews, the silence of mop buckets at dawn, the whisper of dreams folded too tightly in a janitor's closet. It was simple, and it was everything. When the final chord faded, no one moved. Not for several breaths. It was as if the room itself had forgotten how to exhale. Then slowly Tyler stood, alone. Then another, and another. The entire hall rose in a quiet standing ovation, not out of pity, but reverence. Grace stood, bowed lightly, and stepped back from the piano. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply smiled. Victory didn't need medals. It only needed truth. Later that night, Grace returned to her small apartment. A letter had been slipped under her door. The handwriting was delicate, almost hesitant. She opened it. "You played what I never had the courage to feel. Thank you." It was unsigned, but Grace knew. She placed it gently in the same wooden box where she kept her first sheet music, next to the letter from the forgotten judge. A quiet closing note. In the months that followed, the story lingered. Mr. Carter stepped down from his post and opened a free music program for underprivileged youth in the Bronx. Tyler was accepted into Juilliard's full-time piano program, the first in his family to pursue music professionally. Carla Nguyen received her first journalism award for her reporting on Grace. And Grace? She returned to the church on Sundays, still played, still quiet, still Grace. But now, the silence she carried was different. It was no longer about being unheard. It was the peace of someone who had finally been seen. The story didn't end with applause. It ended in a pause, a gentle reminder. Talent doesn't care where you come from, but the world should. And one more lesson echoed far beyond the concert hall. Sometimes the most powerful voices don't rise above the crowd. They rise after decades of being buried beneath it. And when they do, we must be brave enough to listen and humble enough to change.